Hello. So now we start our journey into very commonly used non-linear models for supervised learning. That is the neural networks. And this is the first in the introduction. We first go through the preliminaries. So in animals, learning occurs within the brain and the processing units are the neurons. These can be of different types, but operation is similar. We have the transmitter chemicals within the fluid of the brain, which raise or lower the electrical potential inside the body of the neuron. And based on this, if it crosses a threshold, the neuron spikes or fires, and a pulse of sudden fixed strength is sent. The axons are connected to other neurons. Just to mention, most of the material from this slides are taken from this book by Stephen Marsland. I have written here. Okay. So the brain and the neuron. A neuron is typically connected to many neurons, which is through almost 10 to the power 14 synapses within the brain. And each neuron is kind of a separate processor performing simple computations. And this makes the brain a massively parallel computer. A simple way of drawing it is like this. So we have these neurons and all connections. And learning happens by modifying the strength of synaptic connections between the neurons. So these are the connections, right? These are the connections. We have this line from this neuron to this neuron. Similarly here and here. So we see so many these connections. These are the weights which correspond to the synaptic connections, and these change. And that is how the learning is happening. But how do these weight change happen, or what is the theory behind it? So there's this scientist Hebb. They studied and said that the changes in the strength of a synaptic connection is proportional to the correlation in the firing of the two connecting neurons. So if two neurons are connected by a synapse, then the changes in the strength of these connections are proportional to the correlation in the firing, which means if two neurons, say we have these neurons which are connected, and if they consistently fire simultaneously, then this connection is supposed to grow. Like I'm making it bold. And if they do not, then the connections will die away. So this connection will die away. So the idea is that if two neurons both respond to something, then they should be connected. Now we want to see the first model or the first simple model which tried to give the working of a neuron, McCullough and Pitt's neurons in 1943. Other scientists also had tried to even in fact study the neurons of animals, and they measure the differential equations, how the membrane potential change and so on. But we will leave it at that, and we will look into our MNP or the McCullough and Pitts model. See, this is such a simple representation, and the components we can see are first set of weighted inputs. See, we have the input x1 and we have the corresponding weight w1. Similarly, for x2 we have w2, for xm we have wm. So we have the m number of inputs, and each is weighted by its own weight. And then we have an adder that sums the input signals, okay, the equivalent to the membrane of a cell that collects electrical charge. And then we have an activation function. So this is our activation function, which initially we can see it is a threshold or a step function. Okay, and this generates the output. this output O mentioned over here. So X's are the inputs, when you have the W's as weights. This adder generates the sum H, which is passed through an activation function, a threshold function, to generate the output O. Now we see the working by simple example. We have taken the three weights and the three input values. Okay, W1 multiplies by 1, W2 multiplies by X2, which is 0, W3 multiplies by X3, which is 0.5. So we get the sum as 0.5. Okay, this is 1 plus 0 minus 0.5, we get this. Now we have this output function which fires or gives an output of 1 if H is greater than a theta, otherwise it gives a 0. Also, this theta is for us to choose. So suppose we say theta is 0, then what is our output? It is 1. For theta equal to 0, output is 1 since our H is 0.5, which is greater than the threshold, which is 0. And so the output is 1. Here, if we had taken the threshold theta as, say, 1, if the theta was 1, then the output would be 0. Right? So this is clear? Okay, for the different theta, your activation function will give different outputs. So the working of the McCullough-Input model is this. So we can say that the MNP model is a binary threshold device, adds up the input and either fires or does not fire. So which means we can say that this neuron actually works in two parts. We have this adder here and we have this threshold function here. Look at this threshold function. So this is a simple model of a neuron, McCullough and Fitts model. But it has its limitations because real neurons are much more complicated. We may have spikes of outputs instead of a single output. We may have feedback connections back to the neuron, which currently we are not allowing in our this neural network modeling. So we also see that taking only a single neuron, we are not doing much because it is either firing or not firing depending on the inputs. And also, given the same set of inputs, the output is not changing, which means up till now, we have not seen any learning happen. So no learning has not been incorporated, which means if we want to do interesting things with a neuron, we must incorporate or think about how the learning happens or how the weights change. In fact, we just saw by changing the synaptic connections, the strength of synaptic connections, our brain learns. So how do we change the weights? How do we group the neurons into neural network? This will be what we study in the next videos. So thank you. Thanks for watching.